Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome to, I think it's the 16th edition of Office Hours. I'm Adnan Hussein, your host for this weekly opportunity to engage. It's great to be with you as people are coming into the stream on this live stream. I just want to remind you that be generous. That's an important value. Be generous. Share. So share the stream with others who you think might be interested in what is going to be a really fascinating conversation on an absolutely important topic. So share the stream on social media. If you're watching on X, you can retweet it. It is also possible to like the video and boost it in the algorithm. I have a feeling we're going to talk about algorithms. I'm not saying this is a big act of resistance you can do. We're going to talk about real acts of resistance, or at least how to think about positioning it. But, you know, you could still like the stream and help more people come to see it. So at any rate, welcome to everyone. I'm really excited by, this topic because I'm completely ignorant about it. I don't know much about technology. I am a neo-Luddite, I suppose, or at least I'm haunted by neo-Luddism. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think this is a really crucial topic, haunting futures, big tech and resistance. And to discuss this, we have a radical lecturer in computing and decolonial scholar from the Open University in the UK. I also attached an article that maybe people will get a chance to read. If they haven't read it before, they should go ahead and read it afterwards, but we'll be spending some time talking about it and many of the issues that it raises. But I really want to welcome a brother, a comrade, colleague and friend who I've gotten to know over the last couple of years, whose work is so fascinating, Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali. Mustafa, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Office Hours.
Walaikum salam, Adnan. Honored and humbled by the kind invitation to participate this evening. Well, it's evening for me.
Yeah, it's evening for you. It's so good of you. We're at a special time. Instead of 5 p.m. Eastern, we're at 3 p.m. So you get to take off work early, people. You get to join the stream and stop working earlier. But it is great of you to make time in the evening at the end of a busy week there in the evening in the UK. So we're delighted. Okay, well, so with all of that prolegomena out of the way, I thought it might be a good idea to position yourself like. You expressed to me that the very term computer science really does violence to how you see the relationship between computing and society. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about how you situate yourself in this field of computing, broadly.
Yeah, so there's a tendency often to think about computing in relation to the discipline of computer science. But I'd like to suggest that that turns about an abstraction away from something that is more general. So my take on computing is that it is best thought about as a socio-technical phenomenon, and the technical is abstracted away from that, sometimes in order to do some kind of obfuscatory work, some form of violence, to occlude the socio in the socio-technical, perhaps. And that would be the domain of computer science proper, as an abstraction away from computing as a socio-technical phenomenon. That's how I tend to think about this. And that's useful because then if we start to think about computing socio-technically, it means we can think perhaps more in terms of computing as something quite diffuse, maybe like an assemblage or an infrastructure, something like that, right? Rather than thinking about it in the more abstract terms of mathematics, logic, computation, calculation, etc.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I've noted that, as a social cultural historian, I've often thought that historians who try and argue in a sort of simplistic way for technological change being a driver in history, as having agency itself, are often kind of missing exactly the social that you're trying to reintroduce into our thinking about computing. That there are social factors. So, for example, well, let's think of it this way: like historians for a long time talked about the radically transformative consequences of the introduction of the printing press. It suddenly itself was responsible for rapid rise in literature, for creating publics, for democratic pressures as a result of knowledge and information being able to circulate in a different way than had been possible in the slow book manuscript scribal copying culture of late medieval Europe, right? And so it's almost as if the social change is inaugurated by the technology itself rather than the technology having to build upon and being produced by various kind of social conditions and social formations that many technical advances have and could be made that will never actually have any serious transformative effect or be used simply because the social conditions weren't right. Social, political, and other conditions weren't, capable of like using the technology to advance certain projects and certain possibilities. And so we don't hear about the, possible technical developments that didn't fit into some kind of paradigm. And that's not to say that once adopted, the technology, wouldn't itself start to have social consequences, but that's in dialectical relation to conditions that have to be correct, for it to have an impact. And so it's not the agency of the technology itself, it's the agency of the human beings, of the society, and so forth. So how would we kind of think about that? Because what I sense is a real great panic about, where this kind of discourse of radical social change, that we're on the cusp of it, is always, expressed in this kind of panic around how AI is going to do this or that. And we never say people are going to use AI to do this or that, right? It's almost like, the technology. And I guess it's even worse because this technology is, held to have certain kind of autonomous capabilities that open up the possibility in a more direct way than, say, the printing press, of the technological form seeming to have agency. And I'm just wondering how you think about that and how you would explain or help us understand what AI is before we go a lot further in the discussion.
Oh wow, there's a lot in there. Okay, so let's try to unpack a few of the strands that I think I was catching as you were speaking. So one of them is, I guess, a commitment to something like technological determinism, right? So the idea is, as you've sketched, that it's the introduction of new technologies that effectively have an impact on society and culture, maybe in some kind of dialectical relation between them. So there's some kind of feedback, bidirectional kind of relation. But I guess in relation to the kind of contemporary moment where you've mentioned, possibly crisis, anxieties, various concerns about the technology and its transformative effects. I mean, in my work, I'm trying to think about this in relation to various framings, largely of a kind of cultural and sociological nature. So things like the phenomenon of white crisis, which I have written about previously, and how that is, I suggest, entangled with the discourse of existential threat, existential risk, you think about the way that, the threat of nuclear annihilation, climate catastrophe, biohazards, social collapse, catastrophist models of social change, and AI, however that's framed, whether it's through the lens of kind of political economy, thinking about the impact on jobs and the labor market and the effects there, more diffusely in healthcare, education, the arts, etc. Right? But then the other extreme, the looming threat of killer robots. You mentioned autonomy, systems that are out of control, Terminator type scenarios, running in a rampage, killing all human beings. And so you've got like all of these are still within the kind of the ambit of threat, anxiety, risk, the kind of more doomer side of the discourse. But then you've got the proponents, the boomers or boosters, right? AI boosters. Oh, this is going to create a utopia. It will liberate us from work. Don't worry about the loss of jobs. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about that, because we'll all be sailing into Thomas More's utopia, right? Or some variant of that in a tech register, right? I mean, that's the crucial point. Technology is the enabler of utopia. Now,
yeah, that the fully automated luxury communism, right? Yeah, that's
yeah. Although there's, I mean, that's an interesting kind of phrase, title of Aaron Bastani's book. I'm much more inclined to think we're dealing, at least in the present moment, if not for the foreseeable future, with something like fully automated luxury Islamophobia, quite frankly, right? And maybe that's something we can pick up a little bit further down the conversation. But just to return to this, this idea of technological determinism. I mean, you also usefully mentioned or made reference to the idea of agency, right? And this language gets bandied about, thrown all over the place by people across the spectrum. I mean, on the one hand, you've got the AI booster types. Of course, these are sentient. These are agentic. They're autonomous. Blah blah blah. Right? A hefty dose of anthropomorphism at work in these statements, I would suggest, and I think that needs unpacking in relation to the notion of the fetish. Right, that's how I would approach this one, and maybe that's another strand we can pick up. But then you've got even the kind of more critical groups, so not the kind of technological post-humanists, the kind of AI booster types. You've even got the critics, right, of the kind of technological determinist thesis. People like the so-called critical post-humanists, who are still buying into this idea of what some commentators are referring to as an ontological flattening between the human and the other than human. And the other than human we can unpack, at least start to unpack along the lines of, let's say, the animal and the machine, right? And I think there's certain elisions going on in the argument between the human, the other than human animal, and then the other than human machine, right? And certain conceptual frameworks that are being used to effect this elision and this ontological flattening, and thereby feeding into that anxiety, sense of threat, etc., that we are dealing potentially with autonomous systems, artificial agents that are going to kill us all, right? Now, just on the point about the killer robot, I think killer robots are already here, right? I mean, they're being deployed in places like Gaza during the almost 2-year genocidal campaign waged by the Zionist settler colonial project, right? Some were describing it as the world's first AI war. There are others who contest that reading. But AI was definitely in the mix, right? I mean, there were various systems, Lavender, Where's Daddy,
That's right.
Habsura, which translates to the gospel, right? Interesting kind of political theological naming, I would suggest, of
That
that AI
is.
system,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, as Anthony Lowenstein in his book, The Palestine Laboratory, rightly sets out, right? And the way I'm thinking about this, that Palestine is the laboratory, but the killing fields of Muslimstan, that's where it's going to be rolled out necropolitically. And that's what keeps me, it doesn't keep me awake at night. I sleep well, right? Alhamdulillah. But it preoccupies my thinking about this issue of AI in relation to what the acronym is LAWS, Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems. But we haven't even got to what AI means, right?
Right. So why don't you tell us? And maybe once you do, we can explore a little bit why you have such a specific kind of idea of those consequences because of the racialist and colonialist logics behind how they work and operate and have been developed. But first, tell us, yes,
Okay.
how would you tell us? What would you want to tell us about what AI is and how it works?
Right. So maybe the best way for me to get into that would be to point to a policy paper from 2023, which I think was produced by an institute associated with Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, right? This was a really, really useful, for me at least, a really, really useful and very eye-opening policy paper, because this is not an academic article, right? This is a policy document. And it's called A Literature Review of AI Metaphors and Why They Matter for Policy by, I think it's Matthias Maas. And I kid you not, he lists 55 different ways of thinking about what AI is or how to think about it. 55, right? And some of them include, I'll just read a couple of them. It's an information technology, it's about robots, it's about software, it's an organism, it's a brain, it's a mind, it's an alien, it's a supernatural entity, it's a godlike AI or a demon, it's a trick. And then if we think about its operation, it's an autonomous system, it's an evolutionary process, it's an agent, it's about hidden human labor. And then in terms of our relating to it, oh, well, it's just a tool, it's just technology, right? Or it's a slave, or it's a legal entity, or it's a culturally revealing object. In other words, a social mirror, right? Which I think is really getting to the heart of this. It's our creation. I mean, the roboticist Hans Moravec described future artificial intelligences or artificial life forms as mind children. And that theme was picked up by Ray Kurzweil in his book, Singularity. The Singularity is near, and its sequel, The Singularity is Nearer, right? It's coming closer and closer and closer. Terminator or Judgment Day edges closer and closer to us, right? But it goes on, AI is a companion, a malicious actor or a tool, a misinformation amplifier, a judge, a weapon, labor and hustle. I mean, take your pick, right? What is AI, right? Now, the term dates back to 1956, the Dartmouth conference, and it was coined by, I guess, a computer scientist, John McCarthy. Artificial intelligence, AI, artificial intelligence. Now, just bear that in mind. The acronym is the one that's doing all the traffic and floating about, right? But it unpacks as artificial intelligence. Now, I'm going to provide you with another expansion, and then I'm going to give you the acronym, right? And this is I've taken this from another paper. So what if instead of saying artificial intelligence, we said, thinking along the lines of ChatGPT and these large language model based technologies that have everybody either up in arms or absolutely delighted, right? That the AI god is on the horizon or something like that, right? What if instead of artificial intelligence, we referred to systematic approaches to learning algorithms and machine inferences? Now, if you're paying attention, you're able to process that really quickly, the acronym that pops out is SALAMI, salami, right? Now, I mean, the fact that you're laughing says it all. You weren't laughing when we were talking about AI.
Absolutely not. Sounds
Right?
very ominous, but salami,
Yeah,
sounds funny.
killer salamis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you got a frozen salami and you hit somebody over the head with it, I mean, potentially you could
That could be
serious
dangerous. Yeah.
damage. Right. But anyway, the way I like to think about AI, and this returns to my earlier reference to thinking about technology in socio-technical terms, right? I mean, one useful way of thinking about this goes back to a book entitled Artificial Whiteness by a young scholar called Yarden Katz. I think it was published in 2020 by Columbia University Press. And he refers to artificial intelligence as both a tool for advancing imperial and colonial projects and as an ideology, somewhat mimicking the amorphous structure of whiteness. Now, I think that's kind of useful, but I'm very wary about thinking about AI as a tool, right? Because when you say tool to people, they say, oh, you mean like a screwdriver or a butter knife or, I don't know, a hammer or something like that, right? But if you think in terms of infrastructure or assemblage, you're talking about something that is much more diffuse, pervasive, embedded, and ultimately something that might become quite dangerously largely encompassing of the life world, right? I mean, think about other infrastructure. We have the water grid, we have the transport grids, we have the electrical grid, and then we have on top of that the internet. And now on top of that, we have social media. And now on top of that, we have, if you like, AI systems, at least entangled with social media and the internet, right, and the web. And the more these technologies pervade different sections of society, and I'm just thinking intrastatist at the moment here. I'm not even thinking in world systems terms about local global entanglements, just intrastatist at the moment, right? The more concerns about infrastructure becoming critical infrastructure, so much so that it creates dependencies that are potentially life-threatening. So the idea of opposing the technology once it becomes critical infrastructure, that raises alarm bells, right? Because what are you going to do? I mean, you're going to dismantle this, and what's that going to mean for life support systems? What's that going to mean for banking? What's that going to mean for access to our records, our social records? Everything is implicated in this potentially, because this is a GPT, and I'm not talking here about generative, pre-trained transformer, large language model driven neural net type technology. I mean GPT in the sense of a general purpose technology, something that's so pervasive and so diffuse that it becomes part of the background, part of the fabric. It becomes invisible, right? And it's difficult to turn off the invisible because you don't know where the turn off button is once it's invisibilized, right? Assuming there is one. So yeah, I would push back against Yarden's reading of AI as a tool, and he, as I said, he refers to it also as an ideology, similar to whiteness, is in that it's like a floating signifier. It's amorphous, it's shifting, it changes historically to do work, right? But I'm interested in actually thinking about AI as whiteness itself, or whiteness as AI. What might that mean? What does it mean to think about this technology, this socio-technical assemblage or infrastructure, itself being an articulation or manifestation of whiteness itself, more specifically white supremacy?
Well, maybe you can kind of unpack how you might come to that by talking a little bit more um, as you start to do in the article, and you have some interesting references in there to, the work in particular of McQuillan and your take on McQuillan's. And so what I'm speaking about here for listeners is the article that I linked in the show description and on social media. It's an open access journal, Reorient, and anybody can download and read it. And it's in Reorient. I'm forgetting, is it volume 9 and kind of part
number 2?
Yeah. Yes, yeah. And it's called A Butlerian Hauntology. So Reorient, Butlerian Hauntology, A Butlerian Hauntology. And in it, you mentioned, engaging McQuillan's, which, many of us, I certainly am not very familiar with McQuillan's work, but you argued there that there are various intellectual currents informing this, notwithstanding the importance of philosophical exploration of the nature and limits of contemporary AI, but that the latter line of inquiry falls outside the scope and remit of this essay, but that you're concerned, like McQuillan, with the political implications of actual AI as it operates in the world, and more specifically, that it is a form of computation that inherits concepts developed under colonialism and reproduces them as a form of race science. So could you maybe expand on sort of what's behind this sort of conclusion in McQuillan, and elaborate on it a little bit? Like what forms, what kinds of concepts with what relationship to colonialism, and what kinds of form of race science does AI reproduce?
Yeah. So Dan McQuillan's, his book is called, I think, Resisting AI: An Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Intelligence. And we've collaborated on a number of occasions. He's a colleague. His take is largely focused on the eugenic tradition within European experience, historical experience, and how certain ideas, methods, techniques that emerged in the context of European eugenic experience involving the United Kingdom, United States, and most nefariously Nazi Germany, how certain ideas drawn from that eugenic space and that historical period of, if you like, scientific racism, and scientific in scare quotes, absolutely, right? But then, race science was science of the day, right? So it's only a kind of like, from our kind of presentist position, we look back at that and sort of say, well, that's not science, right? But at the time, that was science. So yeah, he in his book, he's making very clear links between the kind of statistical techniques that were present during the historical eugenic era for gathering data, for ranking, sorting, classifying, etc. Techniques that go back to eugenicists like, I think it's Carl Pearson and others, right? And how these same ideas, and we've got to be careful about the genetic fallacy, right? The origin of something doesn't necessarily entail that its usage in the future will always bear the traces of its origin, right? They're just paraphrasing the genetic fallacy. But I think sometimes the genetic fallacy tends to be overused, and it's like a kind of get out clause for saying, oh, no, it's got terrible origins, but it's being used today for really good things, right? And I don't buy that, right? For me, I'm much more interested in sedimentation, right? So how ideas have bad origins, and those bad origins bed down and continue to do bad stuff because the context really hasn't got better, right? And then the deployment and the project hasn't changed sufficiently in a more, if you want to call it constructive or progressive direction, right? So yeah, so I mean, there were things like, as we all know, physiognomy and phrenology, so like, measuring characteristics of the human being's head shape, gait, breadth of nose, skin color, various kind of, like, we would call them like, let's say, biophysical markers, right? That data would be gathered, and then it would be correlated. Here's the statistics coming in to mean certain things in terms of, well, this indicates a person of high intellect. This indicates a person prone to maybe outbursts of rage, over emotional responses, maybe deficient intellect, maybe criminality or something, right? And so what Dan is doing, at least in part of what he's doing in that book, is establishing the historical links, right? This is where it came from, and this is how it has bedded down in sedimented fashion into the technology. So much so that people are now, I mean, there's a distinction I didn't make, I should have made earlier. I did want to bring this up in this conversation between, it's a historical distinction, right? Between what is known as weak AI and strong AI, right? So let me start with the latter. So strong AI is the attempt to replicate human cognition, human emotion, and human sentience or consciousness, right? This first person experience that I'm having, and that I think you're having, and I think every other human being is having, and potentially many other living organisms as well might be having some form of conscious experience or sentience. But weak AI, by contrast, is really about just developing tools and models to try to study what's called the mind, right? So it's not making such a bold claim. It's not about replication, right? It could be about simulation, but there's always the caveat that this isn't explanatory necessarily, right? It could be useful, but we have to subject that to some measure of critique. So yeah, I think the link to eugenics is really important, but I think I would suggest it's necessary, but again, it's not sufficient, right? Now, why is that? And I would suggest that is because you have to understand the eugenic tradition really as an intra-European concern, right? I mean, at the time that you had figures like, I think, Lothrop Stoddard, right, who was he was an Ivy League professor of history in the 20s in the United States, right? He writes this book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, right? That should be on everyone's reading list. Really important and quite telling text, right? Certainly in the genre of white crisis literature, right? But he also writes another book, I think it's called Revolt of the Underman, right? And so, and this is written at a time of white superiority, supremacy, dominance, hegemony, right? And yet there's white crisis. Why? The potential threat of the othered, the external othered, but also the internal problem, pollution of the gene pool, the undesirable. And that's where the kind of class dimension needs to be folded into this, right? That the eugenics project is largely, I would suggest, an intra-European class phenomenon, which I suggest must be entangled with an extra-European colonial phenomenon, right? So it might be eugenics for the core, but it's something else for the periphery, right? But these histories are entangled.
Yes, well, maybe we might begin to explore some of those entanglements by, looking more closely at the article. But before we jump into that, you had something interesting that was in the article, where you suggested that you thought that in addition to recognizing the socio-technical assemblage, those kinds of conditions, that approach that really helps us understand the connections with the computational aspects of race science and for the purpose of eugenics, and as you've explained, that as an intra-European kind of class anxiety being expressed there. That in addition to doing that, there is also some other component that McQuillan might dismiss or underemphasize that you think is valuable and interesting to analyze in connection with those socio-technical dimensions of AI, which is the grandiose rhetoric and sci-fi storylines that obscure it. You do a lot in this article, so I think now's a good time to sort of talk about it. You do a lot with science fiction as a way of doing some kind of analysis of what's at stake in and what the possibilities for resistance are. What do you think is the value of science fiction in this kind of context? I guess the other aspect of it that I'd be interested in is that you also talked about how some people who study the genre talk about social science fiction, because something that I've noticed with all kinds of imaginative or speculative literature, regardless of the temporality or the historical setting in which the genre positions itself. So fantasy is almost always, it seems, set in the medieval, which is of interest to me as a medievalist. And for you as a tech person, science fiction is always, is set or often set in some kind of a future, or if it's a past that's not our own, it's some other world's past, etc. But it's some displaced space, right, where this a future or a kind of past that could be our future, perhaps, is really articulated. But they often don't take into account the social conditions, the social structures. They just think that if you change the technology, but those people act just like we would act in our own society, right? They don't seem to be able to, really portray and represent the social world that is different. Only the technological and physical conditions of a world that's different. So that seems to be what's at stake here in talking about social science fiction, as one that actually imagines a relationship between those things. So why do you find science fiction a relevant kind of field of analysis in connection with actually existing AI, or AI as a real kind of phenomenon to be studied, right? Not just its philosophical dimension.
Yeah, I'm glad you made reference to the social science fiction, right? I mean, I read a lot of science fiction, more kind of, let's call it classical science fiction. I'm less interested in the kind of contemporary work and being produced. But the issue of the particular social science fiction, and I would suggest it was social science fiction that I was engaging with in that particular essay, I would suggest it wasn't science fiction as such, right? It was social science fiction. Now, although you've referenced science fiction as attending maybe to futures or the future and pasts, science fiction, as most people, I guess, maybe have some inclination about, is really just a commentary on the present, right? But trying to potentially do disruptive work, counterfactuals, or holding up a mirror, trying to draw out, themes that are current at the time, etc. I mean, I think about for example, the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, right, which I think is excellent. And it's doing some really very useful exploration in there, I would suggest, about the war on terror. So you have to think about the timing when, these books or television series or movies or whatever cultural productions are made, right? Um, so that's the kind of historical context and background which informs those kind of projects, media projects. But I do think that both Dune and at least as Frank Herbert first wrote it in 1965, I think, and then the prequel trilogy by his son and a co-author, which really does the work of fleshing out the Butlerian jihad. Because the important point about the Butlerian jihad is that's not central to Dune, right? The Butlerian jihad is the backstory to why Dune looks like Dune. I mean, why are there no robots in the Duneverse? Why is there no AI in the Duneverse, right? It's because of the Butlerian jihad, the war against the machines. And machines, or at least in the sense of sentient machines, or sentient robots, they were outlawed, right? And then there's this really nice phrase, which it's in the first few pages of the first novel by Herbert. Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them. I think there is so much in that statement that speaks to how I would want to unpack AI as a fetish in relation to something like the analysis of political economy, political ecology, and political theology, right? But ultimately, the Butlerian jihad led to this statement in what's called the Orange Catholic Bible, right? Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a man's mind. I mean, this is really doing fascinating work, right? Because it's a kind of attack on idolatry.
Yeah.
Right. But again, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I haven't written about this, well, certainly not in published form yet, but I'm really interested in the differences, distinctions, and possible overlaps between ideas like totem, fetish, idol, phantom, ghost, god, and in the Islamicate tradition, sanam or asnam, which is often translated as idols, right? But the more I'm kind of, looking into this, the more I'm thinking, I'm not sure that's right. Yeah, but that's maybe slightly tangential to this. But yeah, just to return to what work I think Herbert was doing. Maybe he wasn't even aware of what work he was doing, right? I mean, it's possible, right? He uses it as a backstory to think about a world or a universe in which there are calculators or computers, but they're actually human beings. They're called mentats, right? Now, this is really very
described as human computers. I mean, human,
right.
computational.
Right.
Figures.
But and here's the rub, and I've just thought about this. This idea that you have computers, but now you have human computers, right? So human computers are, in some sense, successors to computers, right? But if you actually wind the history of computers back, and I'm talking about the real history of computers, right? Going back into, you can take it all the way back to Charles Babbage's difference engine, but let's not go that far back, right? Although that's interesting in its own right, because British imperialism, calculation of, I think, naval timetables for wartime use, etc. So there's always a military dimension to this, right? I mean, that's the important point. These technologies always have this militarized or warlike backdrop. But the early use of computer, if you look it up, it referred to people who did calculations. They were called computers, and often they were women doing it, right? So it was both anthropic in the sense of it was human computers before human computers, and gendered, right? But we are so used to thinking of computers as machines, etc., that this idea of the mentat in 21,000 years in the future or whatever, right, when Dune is set, that's like Oh, right. So they do have computers, but it's actually human beings who've evolved to be able to do computation, right? But that, ironically, that ignores the actual history of human computers. So let's think about this in relation to. So Herbert is using the Butlerian jihad to do some work because he wants to set up this future in which, there aren't uh, computers or.
Can I ask you before we get
Yeah,
into that Butlerian jihad? Just there's
okay.
a funny sound of I don't know if you're hearing it. I don't know. It's like I don't know how to describe it, but it's like a yeah. I can hear it right now. Can you hear something?
No.
It's a clicking, but a fast clicking, da, 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 and it doesn't happen. My sound, if I turn it off, it's not doing it. But I'm wondering.
Let me see if I turn off my mic.
Yes. Okay. So it is coming somehow from your end. I don't know what. Yeah. Where Pilgrim says it's a giant woodpecker. Yes. Just
Delighted to hear the organic and the natural make its way into this
right.
conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But now it's gone. So that's good. But it's come and gone a few times. But it
Right.
doesn't sound like it's audible to
Just
you.
put it down to my Luddite retro tech, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not using the most up-to-date, sophisticated AI-powered
Oh, it's back. There it
microphone.
is.
Oh
Yeah.
wow! Is
A
it
rattling.
drowning out my speech completely?
If you are speaking at a normal voice, it's usually you're totally audible, but we can still hear the sound, but you're audible, so that's fine. I guess
Well, okay. I apologize to you, Adnan, and
that's
to our
okay.
listeners as well. Technology is not great, right?
Yes, there you go.
Yeah. Allahu Akbar, but technology Akbar, no way, right?
Anne Lee says, change your hamster wheel.
Hey, they never let me off, right?
Yeah,
Even though I'm
exactly.
in Dune.
Okay, well, sorry to
Yeah, no,
to
no
interrupt.
issues.
So the Butlerian jihad and the work it does in Dune. Let's
Yeah.
think
So
about that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, what I was trying to do in the article was, take the Butlerian jihad because when I first came across it, I thought that's interesting. What's that all about? Okay, the war against the machines, and I've been thinking about this off and on for at least 30 years. I mean, during my doctoral studies, it was always on the horizon. Autonomous systems, AI, Terminator was always in the background. I remember I went to see Terminator 2 I think it came out in 1992. I was the only person in the cinema at the time, and I watched it and I came out and I thought this was a message beamed from the future, right? This was a documentary. This wasn't a movie, right? This was a horrendous documentary. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, when I stumbled across the Butlerian Jihad and understood what it was about, I wanted to dig deeper, and I particularly wanted to know why Butlerian, right? So if you go into the kind of Dune mythos, right, it's inaugurated by a figure called Serena Butler, right? So the initials are SB. Now that's very interesting because arguably the inspiration for the Butlerian Jihad is another SB, Samuel Butler, right? The author of a book called Erewhon, which is an anagram of nowhere. And embedded within that book is the book of the machines, right? And in there, it's an exploration of the rise of essentially an autonomous machine assemblage that threatens human beings. A war is declared. The humans win the war, and they outlaw this tech, right? So it all ends well, right? There's no fate but what we make, and we made a good fate, right? But it's interesting because that book within a book is based on a series of newspaper articles that Butler wrote in New Zealand, where he explored, and I think this is mentioned in the article, essentially a dialectic, right, of a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis, right? The thesis being killer machines looming on the horizons, war against the killer machines, defeat them, everything's rosy. The antithesis was, well, no, don't worry about that. There's not going to be killer machines. It's all about augmentation. It's about cyborgs. It's about enhancement, right? It's not about AI threatening us. It's more about IA, i.e. intelligence amplification, intelligence augmentation, right? And then I guess the synthesis was, well, yeah, the AIs are going to take over, but let them. It'll be all right. It'll work out well for us. They'll keep us as pets, right? But the Book of the Machines in Erewhon doesn't deal with the antithesis or the synthesis. It just deals with the thesis, and I find that really very interesting. So yeah, and that the Book of the Machines is often credited as the first instance of a singularity killer robot scenario in the literary canon, right? So it's not just a throwaway piece of fiction from a wannabe Lamarckian evolutionist or something like that, right? It's got a lot of weight. It's cited all over the place, and along with, I mean, maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but indulge me. Along with, and I think a 1930, was it 1925 novel by a philosopher and science fiction author, Olaf Stapledon. The book is called Last and First Men. These two works, I would suggest, are part of the scriptural canon of the transhumanists, the posthumanists, the singularitarians, right? In that sense, it is a political theology, or there is theology at work here, right? Sometimes they mask it by saying we have nothing to do with religion and God. This is about science and rationality and humanism and, enhancing the human to become the transhuman and eventually the post-human. I don't buy that at all. I mean, I've read Last and First Men, incredible work, lauded by people like Arthur C. Clarke. Comparable to Tolkien's work, doing that kind of huge. It's not even world building. It's like cosmos building kind of narrative, and again, often referenced by transhumanists, right? So, scripture's a useful way into this, I think.
Yeah, and also your point here about the transhumanists, that's a particular kind that gets closer to something that Frank Herbert seemed to have feared, right? And articulated as, if you let the machines, supposedly it's the machines, thinking for you will become dangerous to you. Actually, it is that, the AI and the machines will be used by some people for the domination of everyone else. And that seems to be the precise genealogy for the big tech giants and the ideologies of transhumanism that seem to animate them, is that we are all going to be relegated to a kind of subordinate humanity, because there will be transhuman, figures who have harnessed the power of the machines and can, control them. And we're all worried about, like, the thinking machines will do something to us, when it's actually, the humans, who will do something to us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think earlier in our conversation, I suggested maybe a useful way of thinking about AI was through the lens of the fetish, right? And, kind of slightly more recently, I've been exploring that idea, initially through maybe the work of somebody like David Graeber. He has a really, really nice idea expressed in a paper. Part of the title is something like fetishes are gods in the process of making. And I think that's really very interesting, because it points to construction, right? The construction of a god, right? In relation to the fetish. But then obviously you've got people, most importantly perhaps Karl Marx, right? in terms of the commodity fetish, right? And
Yeah.
and I mean, I'm no expert on Marxism, but I very much like the idea of, you know, the idea of the fetish being that which treats social relations as relations between things, objects, if you like, right? So it does a kind of masking work, right? More recently, the anthropologist and political ecologist Alf Hornburg, whose work I continue to engage with, largely because he's mounted a very useful critique of the kind of critical posthumanism I mentioned earlier that does this ontological flattening. He's done some really very good work there. You know, he's very cognizant of the need to take on board the decolonial term in relation to overcoming, for example, Cartesian dualism, right? But usefully, he suggests a mistake is being made if one surrenders analytic dualism, right? So we should retain the subject-object distinction for the work it can do to unpack fetishizing moves on the part of various actors, right? So he often talks about the fetish as an artifact which stabilizes social relations, right? And I think that's really very useful, because if we think about you know, AI as fetish, and if we want to think about it as a socio-technical assemblage or infrastructure, but it's actually masking or obscuring these social relations, well, then we need to unpack those social relations, right? And you know, I guess if you're a kind of traditional Marxist, you're going to think about that in terms of, you know, relationship between the bourgeois and the proletariat, right? Or bosses and workers, however you want to frame this, right? But I'm interested to think about this in terms of AI as the fetish and everyone being fixated on the AI itself, masking two forms of IA. One is intelligence appropriation or intelligence accumulation, i.e., exploitation of the intelligence of so-called micro workers or you know, Turkers. There's different ways of describing people who do the laborious work of tagging images, validating images, screening output from systems to say this is offensive content, this is acceptable content, at, you know, psychological harm and minimal financial return to themselves, right? So there's intelligence appropriation and accumulation. There's a kind of sucking up of exploited labor, but that's one form of IA. The other form of IA, in a superordinate position above the AI system itself, is the intelligence augmentation, intelligence amplification. Whether you want to identify that as the cluster of Silicon Valley tech bros, the 1%, however you want to frame that, right? I'm suggesting that the social relations that were being talked about by Marx and by others are usefully unpacked in relation to two types of IA, in relation to this mediating fetish that is AI.
That's very interesting, and seems to also get at something Alexander Luchte is mentioning in the comments, that these tech bro, you know, billionaires, you know, seem to want to or intend to empower themselves also as an enlightened elite. And this goes back to something we were talking about, the kind of 19th century administrative state in the era of colonial capitalist rule and expansion, is, you know, using these kind of computational techniques, this claim of science to run things efficiently and according to logics, but in fact actually keep producing and reproducing these asymmetries of racial logics, oppressive logics, class oppression, and, you know, under this idea of running things efficiently, the technocratic elite. And we hear about this supposedly neutral technocratic elite, which, even they're saying, well, although Trump will be this viceroy, he's going to have like in place technocrats, people with skills to run things efficiently. And what that really means, of course, is reproducing the extractive and the exploitative conditions that are masked, as you've been saying, very much masked under this technological, suppression of the social and the political under this, mask of the technological efficiency and the scientific and the rational mode of dealing with things. So this is like, clearly a very concerning future if you care about human liberation and many other sorts of values. Maybe it's time, that we turn to the question of resistance a bit more directly in the time that we have remaining. And one first question that I have is maybe to get into a broader discussion of resistance and what might enable it, how we might understand it, is first to ask why Herbert calls it a Butlerian jihad. Okay, like now this is also part of a larger, a larger question of the appropriation of an Islamicate historical landscape and culture as the frame and the material in which his science fiction story, unfolds. The Fremen are Bedouin, basically. There's so many aspects, and people have looked into that, why he appropriates that, what the value of it is, but particularly in this context of resistance to what might be seen as the abstract logics of machines. Why is the Islamicate such a useful, or the antidote, or at least the counterpoise for this? It seems interesting. So anyway, I wondered, if we're going to talk about Islamicate sources for resistance, let's first understand, well, why call it a jihad, and then maybe we can expand.
It's complicated, right? And it's complicated because there are very different takes on what Herbert was doing with that term, what the term means. Does it map to, because, for example, this isn't Herbert himself, but his son in this, as I said, kind of trilogy prequel, the first book of which is called the Butlerian Jihad, the second book of which is called the Machine Crusade. So are they the same or are they different, right? And Herbert doesn't help, and I'm talking about Frank Herbert now. Herbert doesn't help us in sometimes mapping jihad onto crusade and crusade onto jihad. Now, is he confused? Possibly. Is he confusing? Certainly. But why is he doing that? Is it some kind of ecumenical venture that he's embarking on? I'm inclined to think that, I don't have a settled opinion on that, and me personally, I'm not particularly concerned to resolve that issue. There are different people out there who have different takes on this, right? I'm of the opinion, and this is I just put my politics out there very clearly in relation to this issue. When the machine launches its crusades, the wretched of the earth respond with jihad. That's how I understand this, right? So I would never reduce the Butlerian jihad to a crusade, personally, right? But if we dig into the literature, I have a more recent piece which was actually presented at a conference a few months back. So it hasn't been published yet. I've got to work it out properly into an article. It was called De-Orientalizing the Butlerian Jihad, right? And that, I think, kind of gives the game away a bit, that, hey, there is more than a smidgen of Orientalism at work in Herbert's mobilization of this Islamicate term, tradition, phenomenon, etc. Right? And as I said, different commentators have different takes on this. Some of them are saying it's, you can't think about the Butlerian jihad without thinking about the Fremen. You can't think about the Fremen without thinking about the figure of the nomad. Ibn Khaldun refers to the Umran Badawi, the Bedouins, if you like, and the Bedouin society and culture. You can't think about that without thinking about messianism and populism and the figure of the Mahdi and the savior. Unfortunately, it turned out to be another white savior, right? So all of that is in the mix. It's not, that's what I meant by it's complicated, right? But and Herbert's also on record as basically saying that the thing about the Bedouins is that they have this capacity to just be irrational and draw on the sensuous and the rest of it, and that can be looked at as really negative, right? But it can also do some really useful disruptive work, right? Because why do we put rationality on such a pedestal? Where's that come from, right? Well, we know where that's come from, right? Enlightenment humanism and its successive iterations through various philosophies, and more recently in a kind of techno-scientific register, right? You mentioned technocracy, you mentioned the kind of like Silicon Valley tech elite, their idea of like we will optimize, efficiently run. The thing is, and this wasn't mentioned, right? When they talk about optimizing and efficiently managing and running society, right? This is biopolitics, right? This is about population management, but that only applies to the core of the world system, right? In the periphery, among the wretched of the earth, there's a different game being played, or at least that's what I argue in my work, and that's called necropolitics, right? That's death dealing. These populations are surplus to requirements. They are useless eaters. We just exterminate them, right? So usually the discourse, I want to smuggle this in as well, if you'll allow me. Usually the discourse of AI, and especially the kind of large language model driven deep learning systems, machine learning systems, etc., right? They make use of what is known as the 3 V's associated with big data. Volume, lots of it. Velocity, get it as quickly as possible. And variability or variation. We need to have as much difference in there as possible. We need to have a kind of full spectrum coverage, right? So I like to think about the 3 V's in relation to what I call the 3 E's, right? The 3 E's of exploitation, which we've mentioned, extraction, which you mentioned, and extermination, which I just mentioned, right? So that's political economy, political ecology, and political theology. Because the way I think about political theology is a hierarchy, a great chain of being, God at the top, and progressing down that chain of being to less significant beings. And that God at the top being replaced by AI as an articulation of whiteness itself. That being the locus of either the human, the transhuman, or the post-human, and everything under that is essentially being potentially surplus to requirements, right? That's the subhumanization or dehumanization of the other, right? So, yeah, I kind of took us off course a little bit.
No, that was very interesting. No, that was really helpful, actually, in kind of bringing it back, the threads that we had started with, like what is the colonialist logic of all of this and the racial kind of regime that's in place. And so how does one explain, your your identification with the whiteness, AI and whiteness as like very similar, in fact not just analogous, but in fact actually the mechanism for extending through this transhumanist sort of orientation to preserve the kind of or recolonize the world, as it were. Like there was a lot of labor that went into attempts at decolonization with varying levels of success in disrupting coloniality in, direct conditions versus the neo-colonial, economic and financial systems that helped perpetuate, capitalism on a global scale. But, despite all of that labor, in some ways, this moment that we're in is an attempt at the recolonization of the world, which is, what attends that, of course, is the dehumanization or subhumanization, as you're saying, in this kind of hierarchy where these transhumanist tech overlords, are creating a different kind of future for themselves that is tantamount to deification and self-deification in this orders. Like we will have, even the sort of what we might say the militaristic defense technology roots of a lot of what, I forget what his name was it Pendleton? I'm forgetting the name, but the total information awareness, right? This way of, bringing big data together, the first real attempts to, use these networks of technological capillaries everywhere that have access to pulling in data that we offer ourselves, to the system, that there would be some way of having total information where you would integrate all these systems together. That is like the fantasy of the omniscience of God. Absolutely. Right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that's like 30 years ago, right? That's not even today. So this has got its history, and now we're seeing it deployed in a new way. So I thought that was actually extremely helpful. But what I want to turn to is there are, of course, also the histories of the resistance. And you start with, in the article, Luddism and the way it sort of haunts the, kind of future tech is the Luddite, past and the history, the way that has been framed as the irrational, illogical, makes absolutely no sense. And therefore we should, use it as a term of derision rather than a term of potential inspiration for controlling and the aspirations behind the expansion of this technology, the eugenicist, colonialist, racist, aspirations. And so I wanted to just get back to why the Islamicate might offer, both in the ideological sci-fi, the ideology today, the actual resistance that's happening. This is a kind of interesting thing to consider. And it just recalls to mind, there was a very good essay in Al-Fidai by Jonathan Turner, and we actually interviewed him for Guerrilla History, and that should come out very soon. But a wonderful article about 100 years of Fanon. And, this year is the 100th, anniversary of his birth. And the author wanted to, reclaim a living Fanon for Gaza, and of course we know that there had been quite a lot of discussion about Fanon. You've invoked him with the wretched of the earth, of course. There's been a lot of discussion around Fanon since October 7th, about the applicability, the relevance. Is this different? Was Fanon correct? Is he incorrect? I mean, basically, there was a new biography by Adam Schatz that tried to defang, the radical kind of component and so on. So this was a really interesting article that I would, recommend to people to go check out, and also listen to the episode on Guerrilla History that should be coming out soon. But he quotes, something that I was aware of only recently myself, because I had an MA student who worked on this Fanon Shariati kind of relationship, that the apparent correspondence, some people argue that it's really Shariati's kind of production of it. But in any case, the question is open, should be investigated. But what's interesting here is the way in which an Islamicate thinker right, is trying to understand decolonization and invokes and uses either the real Fanon writing to him or an invocation of Fanonian theory about about decolonization from the Wretched of the Earth, voices some very interesting statements, one of which is this: the world of Islam, this is supposed to be in Fanon's voice here, Fanon's words or his voice. The world of Islam has fought against the West and colonialism more than all Asia and all Africa. And although I do not feel the same way towards it as you, meaning Shariati, who is a devout Muslim, I would like to emphasize more than you do yourself your remark that Islam harbors more than any other social powers of ideological alternatives in the Third World, or with your permission, the Near and Middle East, both an anti-colonialist capacity and an anti-Western character. And of course, Fanon thought an anti-Western character was absolutely crucial, because if you are to build a new humanism, which is necessary, it's only because the supposed humanism of the West was actually a colonialist, racialist humanism that wasn't truly universal, but claimed to be universal while perpetuating the colonial world order. So you had to get rid of that humanism, and you needed a anti-Western, rebellion at the philosophical level as well as at this kind of political level to create the new human, And so this just seems to get at so many of the things that you were interested in this article. So I wanted to raise that with you and then say, tell us why and how you think the Islamicate, why there should be what you're calling a real Butlerian jihad, and what resources that we can draw upon, and what that should and could look like, and is it happening right now in some ways in Gaza, with the resistance against, the techno colonialist future that the Israeli model portends for not only Muslimistan but all the wretched of the earth.
Right. So, the Shariati Fanon thing is, as you said, it's nebulous, right, and unsettled. But what I think is interesting is, some time back I read an essay by, I think his name is Fawzi Slisley, and I think it was called "The Elephant in the Room: Frantz Fanon and Islam," something like that, right? And then he wrote another essay, kind of dealing with the same thing but slightly different. And he did some very useful work in those pieces, in my opinion. And essentially, it was arguing that there was a certain kind of blind spot in how Fanon was engaging with the Islamic or Islamicate experience that informed the Algerian resistance. And people are product of their times and their biases and things, etc. Right? And so, this essay was useful because it wasn't a kind of gotcha moment and dismissive, but it was trying to attend to this with a view to saying, at least the way I was reading it, what might happen if you relaxed Fanon's slightly dismissive attitude regarding, the tendency of the Algerians to maraboutism and all this kind of like irrational behavior, right? If you were to relax those and dethrone rationality, right, or at least put it in its place, because also we need to make distinctions between what in our tradition is called the aql, right, the if you want to call it the intellect or whatever, and rationality as what comes to be calculative rationality in the contemporary moment, right? There are shifts that take place in these terms. It's not like the terms are always the same. Intellect, reason, rationality, they're not synonyms, right? I think you're on a mute. Anand, do you want to be on the mute? I was just wondering whether you were commenting back to me.
No, please continue.
Okay. Right. So, if you were to relax some of those kind of concerns of Fanon's, that does raise the kind of question that you're asking. What is it about Islam, right, that might be this resource? And, at the risk of, being somewhat essentialist, right? And because that's always, we have to be so careful not to be essentialist, right? Whereas I'm not too worried about being essentialist about certain things, right? I think that, it is of the essence of Islam to say no, to refuse. I mean, in our so-called creedal formula, right? There is no divinity, there is no God but Allah, right? La ilaha illallah. The first word that's uttered is la. That's no, that's negation, that's refusal, that's known as a nafi. It's like, no chance, no way, we're putting up the hand. This is opposition, right? So I think an oppositional orientation is kind of hardwired into Islam. Whether we're at war or whether we're at peace, it's there. It's in the fabric, right? And I think it ebbs and flows. It takes different forms at different times. But I think that, there's a rich history of kind of pre-modern, pre-colonial, or certainly anti-colonial. So before the decolonial intervention, the post-colonial era, and the rest of it, right? There's anti-colonial resistance mobilized by Muslims all over the place. It's not just in one place. I mean, you've got, in Algeria before Fanon, before the FLN and all of that, right? You have Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi.
Yeah, that's right. Abdul Qadir
who was absolutely not just a Sufi, right?
Mm-hmm.
But understood at the time to be potentially the leading commentator and exegete of Sheikh al-Akbar, Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn Arabi.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this isn't just some Sufi guy over here, right? This is a major figure launching a jihad from a very young age, right, against the French, right? But then you also have the Lion of the Desert himself, Sheikh Umar Mukhtar, who also is a Sufi. We have Sheikh Uthman Danfoudi, also a Sufi. We have Sheikh Shamil or Imam Shamil of the Caucasus, also a Sufi. We even have Sheikh Qassam, from which the Qassam brigades get their name, a Sufi who actually wanted to join, I think it was Umar Mukhtar, in repelling the Libyans. So what is it about these Sufi Muslims, right? Because it's not like that's all they're doing all day long is just fighting battles, right? They're in deep meditation, they're in deep spiritual practice, they're going into khalwa, into retreat, they're going into the ribat, the fortress, but when they come out of the ribat, the map of the world changes, right? They launch these jihad campaigns. And I mean, I read a very interesting article written by, I think, a Russian scholar looking at Dune in relation to political Islam. So we're talking about Islamism now. We're not talking about these anti-colonial and pre-colonial formations. We're talking about even more contemporary formations, right? And he was saying there's something in political Islam that just says no, it just refuses. It provides over and above ideology, something that motivates, inspires, actualizes, finds itself embodied in the resisting Muslim, right? And he ties this to liberation theology, those kind of currents, but also I guess we would call a Muslim decolonial currents as well. In my own way, I try to contribute in some sense to that discursive space, but it's a big project, right? There are lots of ways of doing kind of Muslim decolonial or Islamic decolonial kind of work. But that's how I would respond to that. And I don't know if that answers your question. But
No, that's wonderful. And I would just encourage, like, all of our listeners to go check out a discussion that I had with Nick Estes, kind of Red Nation, Adnan Hussein discussion about indigenous spiritualities of all different varieties and anti-colonial resistance, because we had an occasion to talk about the interplay and intersections between indigenous movements and the way that they used spiritual traditions to frame their resistance, to motivate their resistance, and so forth, and the long history of Sufi anti-colonial movements everywhere that you mentioned: North Africa, West Africa, the Caucasus, Southeast Asia. People should check out a very interesting article by Khairuddin al-Junaid on warrior jihadism that really documented several different Sufi orders and groups that resisted the Dutch, resisted the British in Southeast Asia. And so this is a really interesting issue, and it's something that I think we see in the context of Gaza that a lot of commentators have not been able to reconcile with certain ways of thinking in Western Marxism about a narrow secularism that comes from European historical kind of traditions of anti-clericalism against the established church that was a reactionary force, had to be uprooted, but that this doesn't always translate perfectly to the resources in the global South or in indigenous societies for what capacities are available. And even in Christianity, like you have liberation theology, you've got a whole tradition. So the question is there ignoring of a potential and important resource here in the liberation struggle? And we're both are more familiar, of course, with have some acquaintance with those other contexts, but we know about the jihad of the Sufis against colonialism, and as something that's really, really significant, in the history, in the culture, in the tradition. And that's sort of the question: is the new forms of oppression that you've been talking about and causing us to think very carefully about, that come with tech, these tech futures and what's at stake in them, reproducing the colonial and racial regimes, is what kind of anti-colonial resistance may arise and have to arise. And we should be open to the variety of sources that this may come, while we're observing that it is happening right now. In Gaza, they are resisting. They are waging something of a Butlerian jihad that repurposes, indigenous manufacture of weapons and techniques of guerrilla insurgency, of guerrilla war, to defeat the much vaunted technological mechanisms of control and death dealing, the necropolitics you've been talking about. So it seems to me that this article and this discussion that we've been having and your insights in it are actually, really valuable for opening up the possibilities that we have to think through and embrace together if we want to see a better future, if we still want to have that better future. So I really want to thank you so much. I don't know if you have a final thought, and if you would like to tell listeners and viewers, how they can follow your work. The article will be linked, but anything you want to tell people, maybe how to follow you on social media as well, before we close.
Okay, thanks for that, Adnan. So yeah, one thing we didn't mention, that I'd like to sneak in very quickly if we have time, is the issue of hauntology itself, right? Because that was in the title of the article. And it's for those in the audience who may be familiar with this, it's a term that goes back to, at least in one major setting, Jacques Derrida, right? So it's a kind of compound of the idea of haunting and ontology, and it's to do with his work in deconstruction and the play on indeterminacy and the inability to kind of settle an issue, right? The interplay between presence and absence. So the figure of the ghost, right, is arguably that which is from the past, in the sense that it is a no longer, but it's also in the present in some sense, right? So how do you settle it? Well, does it belong to the past or does it belong to the present? Well, that's the whole point, right? It's either undecidable or certainly indeterminate, right? Mm-hmm. But I was reading through the essay again earlier today, and there's a commentator who makes a very interesting point, which is hauntology is not just about the past, it's actually also about the future, in the sense that why are there these spectres haunting us, right? So what does the Communist Manifesto open with? The famous lines, there's a spectre haunting Europe, the spectre of communism, right? And then a colleague of mine, Zachary Loeb, he's got a really nice article called Spectres of Ludd, right? And in there, he as you would expect, the argument he's making is the one I make in this essay, or at least reference, that the Luddites themselves, even though the Luddite uprisings were put down very quickly and very brutally, I have to say, right? At one time, there were more troops, British troops, deployed against the Luddites than they were fighting against Napoleon. Right? That gives you an indication of the threat that the Luddites posed. Right? They were against machinery hurtful to the commonality. They weren't anti-technology. As I say to people, how could they break weaving machines, spinning machines with these Enoch hammers if they were anti-technology? Right? Because a hammer is an item of technology. Right? They were also wearing clothes. They weren't running around stark naked. Clothes are a technology. Right? So let's disabuse ourselves of this caricatured and rather abusive understanding of Luddism as something, a synonym for being anti-technology. No, it's about a qualified rejection and opposition to certain technologies deemed hurtful or harmful to the commonality, right? And the Luddite spectre persists, and we're living through it. And it seems to surface in various cycles. I mean, when the internet first came in and there was all concerns about that, there were spectres of Ludd then. And then it kind of, bedded down, and now we have AI, and it's resurfacing again. In particular, in relation to people calling for things like, we need a neo-Luddite uprising. That's the term you used earlier, right? Neo-Luddite uprising. And then others calling explicitly for a Butlerian jihad. I mean, the first one that I managed to find goes back exactly 10 years ago. Some guy saying, maybe we need a Butlerian jihad, right? Because this tech's getting out of control. Right? And it keeps surfacing. But I want to ask this question. If we were to just call for a jihad, how many people would sign up? Right? I mean, Butlerian jihad, no problem.
Less than a few.
Jihad, right? So what's going on there?
Well, maybe we have to call it a Butlerian crusade, and then everybody will be so excited.
We'll just say, we're just going for a crusade. Who wants to sign up, right?
Right.
The problem is, it's the tech bros that are calling for the crusade.
Well, that's right. They're doing the machine crusade, as you're saying,
Yeah.
So,
And just this final point, there's a really interesting book from 2007 by a self-styled, and this is his description, not mine, a self-styled vulgar Marxist called Richard Barbrook, who's famous for writing this seminal essay called The Californian Ideology. Right? Maybe some people have read it. I think it's from 95 or something. The book is called Imaginary Futures, From Thinking Machines to the Global Village. Right? And he's got this really nice phrase, which is a kind of riff off, I think, the historian and philosopher George Santayana. Right? So everyone's heard this thing. I'm going to probably butcher the paraphrasing. But those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. Right? So Barbrook's got this really nice phrase. He says, those who forget the future are condemned to repeat it. And this is exactly what happens with this idea of every 20, 30, 40, 50 years. When are the jetpacks coming? When are the flying cars coming? When will we be colonizing the moon? When will we be settling on Mars?
I want my teleporter now.
That's the one, right? I mean, they should watch The Fly. It doesn't turn out well, right? Matter transporters, no, don't go there.
Yeah, well, this has been so much fun, and also so rich and interesting, and I know people have enjoyed and benefited from the discussion. Mustafa, we're going to have you come back and talk about, other components of your myriad interests and expertise. I like to point out to people that or would like to point out to people that you are probably in some ways the perfect listener for the content that we do here, because you like the Names of God series and you always give me comments back on it. You enjoy these political encounters, and
particularly with Butch Ware. That was great.
Yeah, that was a really great discussion. Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with him again sometime soon. But so at any rate, I really appreciate you coming and sharing your analysis and expertise. And we don't have a lot of people who know very much about technology in my network. You know, you're one of the people I really treasure for a myriad of things, but uniquely so because you also know how to integrate a really critical and much needed analysis from the same resources, you know, of the kind of Islamicate standpoint and kind of anti-imperialist critical engagement. So I really thank you for coming and sharing that with us, and we hope to have you back on again really soon, inshallah.
Inshallah, honored and humbled as always.
Okay, everybody, please, before you leave, like the stream, boost it on the algorithm. That terrible invention of Al-Khwarizmi. Let's not forget. So there is an Islamicate, resistance, but maybe the Islamicate is also part of what created these algorithms as well. So we've got both ends of the stick. But please do boost it on the algorithm, like it, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you again really soon. Unfortunately, next week I'm going to be traveling, so I won't be able to do office hours. Next week you have a respite. But inshallah, we'll come back really soon, and we'll see you then. Until then, peace with justice and solidarity to you all. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.